75th birthday of Dr. David Pike. In some ways, he needs no introduction to our community. David is probably the longest standing member of the faculty at this point, having joined the AUP faculty in 1968 and weathered the student revolutions in Paris in his very first year on the job. And he has been continuously with us for all of those years. What I would like to do tonight is to just read a very short bio of his life that he gave me today, which is the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern version of an interesting and rich life, and so funny in its own right that I have decided not even to edit it. He is a pillar of the faculty. He is also a pillar in his field. I think everybody knows that. At the end, I'm going to read just one or two or three of the many, many books that he has written. Here's how many books he has written, but I will just read a couple of those titles at the end. Has guided student research, has been a leader in his field for decades. But I would like to read you his bio. Born in England. Sent to one of those English public schools, Blundell's in Devon, founded 1604. Served in the Royal Artillery, was transferred to Allied Intelligence. Entered into the family business, Lloyd's of London. You can work alongside someone for years and only find out things like that after many decades. Bored, ran off to Italy for a year, returned to Lloyd's. Totally bored, ran off to Spain, did not return to the UK. Left for Canada, entered McGill, comparative literature. Entered the US with a green card. A bit bored, moved to Mexico. Finished up in Monte Alban, digging, wrote his first 2 articles for a London magazine on pre-Cartesian civilization. In Mexico, lost, unwanted, with nothing in sight, like Wagner at 52, wiped out, finished, a telegram arrives from Stanford. Admitted, come. A new life, a PhD, appointed to the Stanford faculty, taught political culture of Latin America. I've got to shut the door. A new life, a PhD, appointed to the Stanford faculty, taught political culture of Latin America, decided on a second doctorate, this time in contemporary history at the Université de Toulouse, joined Chapman University World Campus afloat, round the world twice. In 1968, joined ACP, the American College of Paris, which was us in our first emanation. Considers his greatest contributions to AUP his 3 international conferences. The first in 1982 on the Soviet threat to world peace. The PCF refused to participate, so it becomes gloves-off anti-Soviet, with star speaker Gorkin in 1920 in Stalin's entourage. The second in 1989 on the opening of the war. Participants include US, Soviet, British, French, German, Italian, Polish, Finnish, Yugoslav, and Japanese historians. Languages, English, French, and Russian. 3 of the 6 Soviet historians, including Afanasyev, who died this week, were prevented by the KGB on the morning of the opening day from taking off from Moscow. The third in 1995 on the closing of the war. Same array as in 1989, with the addition of Philippines and New Zealand, liberators of Trieste in 1945. Co-organizer and co-chair at the Stanford 1996 Conference on War Crimes and War Criminals, which many of you know is one of the major subjects of David's oeuvre. Since then, goofing around, but 7 days a week. So before I pass on somebody who's been doing a whole lot more than goofing off, I want to read just the title of some of his books. Conjecture, Propaganda, and Deceit and the Spanish Civil War, In the Service of Stalin, Spaniards in the Holocaust. God, it's really small, David. I mean, I can hardly make this out. Crimes Against Women, France Divided, and I really cannot read the other titles there too. Franco and the Axis Stigma. So many works on the Spanish Civil War, many works on World War II. And he is now doing 3 or 4 projects going at the same time. Gallia Dividida, and called to account the killers of Mauthausen on trial. And you're also working on a film, which should see the light in a very short number of months now. So with no further ado, I'm going to ask David to come to the podium to deliver his birthday lecture, and afterwards we will go into the room next door and lift a glass in his honor.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for coming. If you get tired, I suggest, seriously, that we move to the bar next door for a pause. It's my birthday, after all. I'll join you if we go on, and some of you need to move. I'll stay as long as I have just one listener, and I keep a clock close to me. The King versus the Constitution. I call it the Constitution, and you may say there isn't one. And you'd be right, in the sense it is not written down. But there are bits and pieces that serve the purpose, and the first bit is what we celebrated in June in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. Another bit is the Bill of Rights. Put the bits together and you know what you can do and what you can't do in a democratic monarchy in which Parliament is supreme. In the 19th century, Walter Bagehot argued what it could mean if tonight Parliament voted to abolish the monarchy and execute the monarch. Then Mr. Cameron would have to get into his limousine, drive down the Mall, and present the death warrant to the Queen, and the Queen would have no choice. She'd have to sign it. All this is unlikely. What it really means is that as long as there is a monarch, no one can take command of the armed forces or take control of the courts, because the army and the courts have sworn their oath to the monarch. Killing the monarch doesn't change anything. The essence of democratic monarchy is not the power it gives the monarch, but in the power it denies everyone else. A further point about the parliamentary system. The government and the opposition sit on either side of the speaker. The government to his or her right, presently there's a lady speaker, the opposition to the left. They are separated by an aisle. You don't cross the aisle. It's just sufficiently wide that two swordsmen facing each other with drawn swords don't quite touch. And now to the late 18th century. A few of you may remember the bicentennial in 1976. What was surprising was how the new generation of historians on both sides of the Atlantic have come to revise their look at what the war was all about. Professor John Schutz of the University of Southern California said this: "The rebels viewed the British government as radicals. Many were shocked at the mere mention of the word revolution. They were very straight-laced people, but they had become convinced that something desperate had to be done, that to save their liberty, they had to fight. It was far more than a war of independence. It was a struggle that would determine whether England, too, if she won the war, would sink into some form of absolutism that would end in a revolution. Why should England be exempt from revolution? Its parliament had already shown it could execute a king. In some ways, it was a replay of the Civil War of the 1640s, with both sides fighting for their interpretation of the status quo. The traditionalists for the king, the constitutionalists for parliament. As late as spring 1776, delegates from 6 of the 13 colonies came to the Continental Congress under instructions to vote against separation, 6 out of 13. Tens of thousands were hostile to the rebellion. In the Boston Press in 1775, Daniel Leonard wrote this: "Rebellion is the most atrocious offense that can be perpetrated by man. It dissolves the social band, annihilates the security resulting from law and government. It introduces fraud, violence, murder, and sacrilege. And he referred to the Continental Congress in terms of disaffection, petulance, ingratitude, and disloyalty. The Loyalists included the entire Anglican clergy, New York City, Philadelphia, parts of the Carolinas and Georgia were more loyalist than rebel. They were supplying the redcoats with food, while Washington's men were starving. Even in 1780, Washington had only 9,000 men, while 8,000 Americans were in redcoat uniform. Well, let's look at the background to it all. Europe in the 18th century. 3 types of government: absolutist monarchy, France, Spain, and elsewhere; benevolent despotism, Frederick the Great in Prussia, Catherine the Great in Russia, Joseph in Austria. And there was limited democracy in England. England's recent past, go back 100 years, a civil war that left the king dead and Parliament supreme. And then the growth of cabinet government under William and Mary, and then the throne moves to a German house, the House of Hanover. The cabinet system develops, a council of ministers presided over by the king as chief executive. But little by little, by the first minister, the prime minister, takes his place. Then came the War of 1756-1763, the 7 Years' War in America, the French and Indian War, against France and Spain. A war fought on a much wider sphere than North America. It was the widest arena yet. The British government had made an enormous effort to defend the American colonies against the combined power of France and Spain. At the same time, some colonies had contributed heavily. Virginia and Massachusetts had virtually bankrupted themselves in voting men and money for the war. It wasn't a coincidence that Massachusetts and Virginia later took the lead in the resistance. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain emerged, 1763, as the most powerful country in the world. France and Spain had been removed from the eastern half of North America. The colonies were safe, but at the same time, it made them feel less dependent on British protection. Wars, of course, cost money, and at the end of it, Britain's national debt was enormous. How was the debt to be paid off? This was the root cause of everything. Look first at population. In America, the population 2.8 million, including 600,000 black slaves. The total population of the colonies was 1/3 of that of England, which in turn was 1/3 of that of France, 8 million in UK, 24 million in France. The Americans were not all from the British Isles by now. There were a number of German and Scandinavian immigrants. London, the biggest city in the world, with 700,000, but Philadelphia was the second largest city in the empire with 34,000, bigger than Bristol, bigger than Dublin. So how were the American colonies governed? They had British protection against the French and their Indian allies, but each colony had its own legislature, ran its own internal affairs, and it was a well-established principle. The colonials would tax themselves through their own assemblies. That's what they did in the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War. The royal governors had powers, but they used their powers sparingly. They were in no way Spanish viceroys. They were there to keep the peace and nothing else. The colonies cost England nothing in forts, garrisons, and the like that you see in the Spanish Empire. Well, now let's take a closer look at the 4 leading players, George III, Lord North, Benjamin Franklin, and William Pitt. George III, first of all, and be ready to be surprised. This is the first Hanoverian king to be liked, at least at first. He spoke English without an accent. George I didn't speak any English. The Prime Minister, Walpole, had to speak to the king in Latin. George III was young and vigorous. Everything was going for him. Far from being lazy, he was a workaholic. As a writer, he was tireless, writing in his own clear hand and writing extremely well. He also wrote and spoke fluent French, and in his moral life, there was never a scandal in this court. He was quite unlike his son, the regent, who was a pure rake, but George III remained devoted all his life to his bride, Queen Charlotte. He was a genuinely religious man, attending church regularly. He was the country gentleman. He liked his nickname, Farmer George. He was an accomplished musician. He loved Handel. He invited the young Mozart twice to perform during Mozart's visit to London. He welcomed Haydn. He founded the Royal Academy. One of his favorite painters was Benjamin West from Philadelphia, who became president of the same Royal Academy after the war ended. But as everybody knows, his character was fatally flawed. As his German mother never stopped saying to him, "George, be a king." He was by nature headstrong and obstinate, deaf to good advice, blind as to vision. He dominated his government, determined not merely to reign but to rule in a country that thought it was behind. All of that was something in the past. But was he an evil man? I would say no. Unquestionably, he was the victim of a disease that nobody in the 18th century or even the 19th century understood. He was sick with porphyria, which is not inherited as hemophilia is. Attacks come and go without warning, but they're no different from madness, and this is recurrent madness. It is now thought he was temporarily insane in 1765 when the Stamp Act passed in Parliament. It flared up again later, twice, and we'll see him sinking into clear madness later. So much for George III. Now to Lord North, who was not what we normally think of him. He was Prime Minister for 12 decisive years, 1770 to 1782, so we pin it all on him. But North was an amiable man with few enemies, and even his enemies remained friendly. He had great political skills, a capacity for hard work, but he lacked vision, the vision thing. And when the war came, he was not a war leader, and he knew it. He admitted it to the king again and again. "Accept my resignation." The king refused to accept his resignation. The fault of Lord North lay in his virtue. He was loyal to a fault. And now to Benjamin Franklin. On his first visit to London, 1757, he worked to try to shape a political understanding that would keep America in the British Empire. The government would not listen. In 1760, he still said, "I venture to say that a union among the American colonies is not merely improbable, it is impossible." In 1760. At this time, from 1763 to 1775, Americans sat in the House of Commons. Not many, but a few. There was Barlow Tricothick from Boston, Massachusetts, who served 6 years in Commons and became Lord Mayor of London. Another was Benjamin Franklin. In 1766, Franklin spoke before a full House of Commons to testify against the Stamp Act. He was dressed simply, and when asked by the Speaker to identify himself, he said simply, "Franklin from Philadelphia." When he left 11 years later, Franklin had become a revolutionary. Let's take a moment to look at the state of British politics in the late 18th century. It was democratic, but obviously strictly limited in its democracy. Male property owners only, as in the United States after independence. Political debate was free and everywhere, in the coffee houses, in the pubs, in the countryside, and everybody grumbled alike, grumbled about taxes. In England, you paid a tax to put a window in your house. But this particular tax in the Stamp Act of 1765, taxes for everyone. In England as in America, every single document required a stamp. Without it, the transaction was illegal. Birth, marriage, death. You weren't born unless you had a stamp on it, nor were you dead without a stamp on it. Entering university, get a stamp, £2. If you want a diploma, pay another £2 for the diploma in the stamp. Admission to the bar, £10, but only £6 in England. That showed a bias. But as for freedom of the press, it's not an issue. Newspapers had started back in 1702. The Spectator was the first newspaper anywhere. And they published readers' letters. And the letters showed there was much support for the American position. The London Magazine wrote in 1766, 9 persons in 10 in this country are friends to the Americans and convinced that the Americans have right on their side. The British government did not agree. So it required an opposition leader to shred the government's policy. Here we should note something different between that time and ours, the respect for oratory. Education in England and in America consisted very much in the study of the classics, the study of the orators of antiquity, the importance of logic and of rhetoric. And in times of national crisis, a great speech could carry all before it and exert its powers on a much wider public than the House. The great speeches of the British Parliament at this time were almost without exception the speeches of the opposition. Enter William Pitt, the great commoner, as he is always known. Even when he became the Earl of Chatham, he was still the great commoner. His place in history is secure. He is beyond the reach of any critic. But throughout this whole period, he was rarely well. He would appear often on crutches, cheered into the House by the crowd outside. 1766, January the 14th, the speech from the throne, given by the Prime Minister Grenville. A man who's cool, talented, but pedantic. And Prime Minister Grenville referred to many hostile acts committed in America since the imposition of the Stamp Act. And then came the burning passion of Pitt. I stand up in this place, single and unconnected. As for the administration, every capital measure they have taken is entirely wrong. Their characters are fair, and I'm always glad when men of fair character engage in His Majesty's service. But notwithstanding, I love to be explicit. I cannot give them my confidence. When the resolution was taken in the House to tax America, I was sick in bed. If I could have been carried in my bed, so great was my concern, I would have asked some kind hand to have laid me down on this floor, to have borne my testimony against it. It is now an act that has passed. I would speak with decency of every act of this House, but must beg indulgence to speak of it with freedom. America, being neither really nor virtually represented in Westminster, cannot be held legally or constitutionally or reasonably subject to obedience to any money bill of this kingdom. The Americans are the sons, not the bastards of England. As subjects, they are entitled to the common right of representation and cannot be bound to pay taxes without their consent. In an American tax, what do? We, Your Majesty's Commons of Great Britain, we give and grant to Your Majesty what? Our own property? No. We give and grant to Your Majesty the property of Your Majesty's Commons in America. It is an absurdity in terms. I would fain know by whom an American is represented here. The ideal virtual representation of America in this House is the most contemptible that ever entered into the head of men. It does not deserve a serious reputation. I shall never own the justice of taxing America internally until she enjoys the right of representation. As for the Stamp Act and every other act by the King's ministers, I ask absolute, total, and unconditional repeal. In the next session of Parliament, Pitt again. The Commons of America, represented in their several assemblies, have always been in possession of the exercise of this, their constitutional right of giving and granting their own money. They would be slaves if they had not enjoyed it. This kingdom, as the governing power, has always bound the colonies by her laws, by her regulations, in everything except that of taking their money out of their pockets without their consent. The Prime Minister, Grenville, rose in fury. He was, in fact, Pitt's brother-in-law. Pitt had married Grenville's young sister, aged all of 22. But brother-in-law or not, the Prime Minister, Grenville, in his pedantic tone, I deny that the contention that the colonies cannot be taxed by the House of Commons. Commons taxes the East India Company. Commons taxes Manchester. They are not represented either. This kingdom has sovereign power over America. It cannot be denied, and taxation is part of that sovereign power. Protection and obedience are reciprocal. Great Britain protects America. America is bound to yield obedience. If not, tell me when the Americans were emancipated. Pitt was on his feet the second that the Prime Minister stopped speaking. He was out of order. In Parliament, as in Congress, you cannot speak twice on the same matter. But who on that night is going to call out, Mr. Speaker, point of order? None. The members cheered him on. I pause. William Pitt himself might have paused. I lament that liberty of speech in this House has been imputed a crime. It is a liberty I mean to exercise. The gentleman, the Prime Minister in front, tells us that America is obstinate. America is almost in open rebellion. I rejoice that America has resisted. I come not here armed at all points with law cases and acts of Parliament, with the statute book doubled down in dog's ears to defend the cause of liberty. I draw my ideas of freedom from the vital powers of the British Constitution. The defense of liberty upon a general principle. That is a ground on which I stand firm, on which I may meet any man. The gentleman asks, when were the colonies emancipated? I desire to know, when were they made slaves? A great deal has been said of the strength of America. It is a topic that requires caution. In a good cause, on a sound foundation, the force of this country can crush America to atoms. But on this ground, on the Stamp Act, when so many here will think it a crying injustice, I am one who will lift up my hands against it. In such a cause, your success will be hazardous. America, if she fall, will fall like a giant. She will embrace the pillars of the state and pull down the Constitution with her. Is this your boasted peace? Not to sheath the sword in its scabbard, but to sheath it in the bowels of your countrymen? The Americans have not acted in all things with prudence and temper, but they have been driven to madness by injustice. Will you punish them for the madness you have occasioned? Rather let prudence and temper come first from this side. I will undertake for America that she will follow the example. Upon the whole, I beg leave to tell the House what is really my opinion. It is that the Stamp Act be repealed absolutely, totally, and immediately. That the reason for the repeal should be assigned because it was founded on an erroneous principle. You can imagine the reaction. In the House of Lords, Lord Hardwicke declared, Pitt deserves to be sent to the Tower for treason. But Pitt was not alone. Edmund Burke, Mr. Conservative of the 18th century, made his maiden speech in Commons against the Stamp Act. Unwise, said Burke, unwise, irrational, unworkable, and stupid. In the same year, the Stamp Act was repealed, but it was accompanied by the Declaratory Act. Americans drank to the repeal of the Stamp Act and ignored the Declaratory Act. New York City voted to erect a statue to George III. And in South Carolina, its House of Commons voted to erect a statue not of the King, but of William Pitt. Others move in to the opposition. John Wilkes, Member of Parliament and Lord Mayor of London, who supported the American cause right through the Revolution. The city of Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania commemorates Wilkes and Colonel Isaac Barré, who had fought in the Battle of Quebec, Wilkes-Barre. Wilkes was sent to prison for a civil crime. But when the king refused to allow Wilkes, on his release from prison, to take his place in Parliament, England had a folk hero, John Wilkes. At this same moment, Pitt had a nervous breakdown and had to resign for reasons of health. This is when he became Lord Chatham. So he moves from Commons to Lords. The Lords, of course, are a different place. It's much more solemn. Pitt was much more at home in the free exercise of his eloquence in Commons, but he hadn't lost it. In 1770, Pitt, now Chatham, appears in the Lords. Wilkes is still in prison, and Chatham rises to speak in the Lords. I need not look abroad for grievances. The grand capital of mischief is fixed right here at home. The House of Commons has illegally deprived an elected member of his seat. And since John Wilkes has been deprived of his seat, the whole Parliament is sitting illegally, should be dissolved, and new elections held. 9 days later, the new Lord Mayor of London, William Beckford, Member of Parliament, led a large crowd of supporters of Pitt Wilkes to Whitehall with a petition. Parliament no longer represents the people, says the new Lord Mayor of London. Its acts are unconstitutional. The King's ministers should be dismissed. And John Wilkes again, this is a war of glaring injustice and wretched policy. At this point, only now, in 1770, does Lord North enter the scene. He'll be Prime Minister now for 12 years, from 1770 to 1782. The term used in Parliament today is Her Majesty's Government. But when North referred to His Majesty's Government, he meant it literally, His Majesty's Government. The King fixed policies, North carried them out. And here and then, two men without foresight, without spirit, without vision. The strength of North is in his unswerving devotion and total loyalty, but that is precisely his weakness. He was no war leader, and he knew it. He asked again and again to be allowed to resign. The king wouldn't let him go. The king insisted. If no stamp tax, then something else. But there has to be one tax on the Americans. That has to be kept. We'll make it tea. The Tea Party. But the Massachusetts Assembly came to the same conclusion as Franklin. It was perfectly possible for the American colonies to have independence without renouncing or rejecting loyalty to the Crown. That was, after all, how later it went in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Total independence within the Crown. We're now in April 1774, and it is Edmund Burke now who takes the floor in Commons. He did not argue that Parliament had no right to tax, but he declared, "Revert to your old principles, seek peace, leave America to tax herself, reflect how you are to govern a people who think they ought to be free and think they are not." If it had been left to Burke, if the government had listened to Edmund Burke, the voice of conservatism, there would have been no war. An Englishman, wrote Burke, is the unfittest person on earth to argue another Englishman into slavery. Chatham, again, now in the House of Lords. The Americans can never be defeated. It is our own violent proceedings that have roused their resistance. I will not say that the government can alienate the affections of the king's subjects, but I will say that the king's ministers will make his crown not worth wearing. Franklin, later in life, wrote of this time in 1775, writing about it later. I never heard in any conversation with any person, drunk or sober, expressing a wish for separation or a hint that such a thing would be advantageous to America. But Franklin is now losing hope that North can be persuaded. He decides to leave England. But before leaving England, he visits Chatham at his country home. And Franklin wrote, "That truly great man received me with an abundance of civility. He hoped that the Americans would continue firm and united in defending by all peaceable and legal means their constitutional rights." An official state of war in America existed from August the 23rd, 1775. Well, the War of Independence. To take on a war, anyone needs to take. When frontier fighting began in 1776, there were only 5 British companies in all of America, 500 men to a company, 2 in New York, 1 in New Jersey, 2 in the Carolinas. So from the start, England is overextended, short on everything that counts in war: manpower, ships, supplies. The entire British Army worldwide is only 29,000 plus 10,000 Irish volunteers, scattered: Gibraltar, Mediterranean, Caribbean, Africa, Canada, other places. Few men in England wanted to volunteer to fight the Americans. So the king decided to hire mercenaries and looked to his native Germany. In Hanover, he was the head of state. He could give orders. Lord North was now suffering bouts of depression, regularly offering his resignation. Then along comes Saratoga, the British defeat that changed the whole character of the war, except for one aspect that never changed: the king's determination to persevere and never yield to American independence. The king was not opposed to peace, so long as it was peace without independence. This is what he said: "I will not give myself up into bondage. I will rather risk my crown than do what I think personally disgraceful. If the people will not stand by me, then they shall have another king. I will never put my hand to what will make me miserable in the last hours of my life." This attitude was to keep the war going for another 4 years, while North remains virtually a prisoner to the king. Lord North then, putting it for the government, "If they in America deny our authority in a single instance, it goes to all. We must control them or submit to them." In May 1776, Chatham is back again in the fight. To the Lords, now speaking in the House of Lords: "This has always been my received and unalterable opinion, that I will carry to my grave, that this country has no right under heaven to tax America. Adopt a more gentle mode of governing America, for the day is not far distant when America may vie with our European kingdoms, not only in arms, but in the arts also. Withdraw every one of the oppressive measures of the past 14 years. You may ravage, you cannot conquer. And even if victory were possible, what then? You cannot make them respect you. You cannot make them wear your cloth. You will plant an invincible hatred in their breasts against you. We are the aggressors. We have invaded them. A year later, this is May 1777, Chatham reappears in the House of Lords. His aim is peace without conditions. He never gave support for independence, but for the rights of Americans all the way. We call them rebels, but they are only defending their unquestionable rights. It is no use harping, as the government does, on unconditional submission. We shall never obtain it, nor do we deserve it. Let us try instead unconditional redress. Then, referring to the British use of German mercenaries, he added, if I were an American, as I am an Englishman, while a foreign troop was landed in my country, I would never lay down my arms. Never, never, never. He's now so sick that he has to be carried into Parliament on a stretcher. My lords, you cannot conquer America. If liberty be not countenanced in America, it will sicken, fade, and die in England too. And then came the great game changer, French intervention. December 1777, Louis XVI, Foreign Minister Vergennes, presenting a cabinet paper to his king. France would inform the Americans of a readiness to entertain proposals for an alliance with the Americans. Notice the caution in the suggestion. Would inform the Americans of a readiness to entertain proposals for an alliance with the Americans. Approuvé, wrote the king on the document. Well, the French intervention was, it goes without saying, not to help the colonies win freedom. It was to weaken England. The French motive, absolutely normal, understandable, revenge for 1763. Vergennes himself, as foreign minister, admitted this repeatedly. It was only after the French decision was formalized in 1778 that France dispatched naval armadas under Admiral d'Estaing, Admiral de Grasse, and General Rochambeau. We come to 1778, June the 14th, England formally declaring a state of war with France, and in the same month the French fleet under d'Estaing appears off New York. The British Army in America now has to rethink its strategy. It cannot hold all of British North America, not with 5 companies. It would now act defensively to hold Canada, Nova Scotia, Rhode Island, New York, the two Floridas, and, if possible, Philadelphia. From now on, more and more people in England are saying, stop the unwinnable war in America and concentrate on fighting the French. Unwinnable, because there was no chance of dealing a knockout blow to the colonists. This was asymmetrical war with guerrillas. Guerrilla was about to win a name for itself, with the guerrilleros in Spain fighting Napoleon. And guerrillas can swim like fish in the sea, which reminds us of Vietnam. They did all the things, these guerrillas, that gentlemen shouldn't do, according to classical warfare. They're fighting at night, fighting in the woods, fighting on rainy days. Gentlemen don't do that, but guerrillas do. And meanwhile, the British have every reason to worry about the French. Suppose the French fleet in Toulon, the Mediterranean fleet in Toulon, sailed, instead of sailing west to the Americas, to North America, instead of sailing west, it sails north, meets the French Atlantic fleet in Brest, and the two fleets sail northward into the English Channel. They would have an overwhelming superiority in the Channel. Invasion of England would be open. But France hesitates. From 1778 to 1780, there's a 2-year stalemate. There's no major battle. And then a serious turn. In 1779, France signs a secret treaty with Spain. Spain is promised Gibraltar. The Royal Navy is now really stretched thin. It has to face the combined sea power of France and Spain. It requires a whole new set of calculations for the Royal Navy and for policy in America. But George III, deaf to all advice, remains set in his position, quash the rebellion in America. If things get worse, he thought, he could still hold New York while letting the rest of North America go. So England is now fighting without allies, as it deserves to be, against not only France and Spain, but the colonists are aided by Holland, Russia, Sweden, Denmark, and especially the Prussians under von Steuben. Well, the Lafayette myth will live forever. But if you were a Frenchman and you wanted to fight for freedom, instead of crossing the Atlantic, all you had to do was run downstairs and take on the first man in uniform in the service of Bourbon tyranny. That's always worth considering. So, who can England count upon for allies? None but Americans. An estimated 1/3 of the American colonists remained loyal. Some 30,000 loyalists took up arms. What turns the tide, and in Britain's favour, is January 1781, the mutiny that breaks out in Washington's troops in New York and New Jersey. Rebels, ragged and starving, are surrendering in droves. It seems in early 1781 that the British are in sight of victory. And that is the moment when Washington signals to the French government, we are at the end of our tether, and now or never, deliverance must come. And the deliverance came. Wallace has set up his base at Yorktown. Yorktown falls. Why? Because the odds have been reversed. There are now 16,000 Americans under Washington, and there's only 6,000 in the force of Cornwallis. But it would take more than the loss of Yorktown to change the thinking of King George. In Parliament, however, there's a new face in the opposition. The young 22-year-old William Pitt II, son of Lord Chatham. So a new William Pitt, called Pitt the Younger, and from the very first, he had inherited his father's grasp of politics, his vision too. But at the age of 22, you can imagine, being an opposition leader at the age of 22, you have to be careful not to overplay your hand. And as a Whig, he is very respectful toward Tory tradition. He doesn't rush to speak or demand the floor as his father did. He waited his turn, and then we have the young William Pitt. A noble lord who spoke earlier has, in the warmth of his zeal, called this a holy war. I am persuaded, and I will affirm that it is a most accursed, wicked, barbarous, cruel, unnatural, unjust and diabolical war. It was conceived in injustice. It was nurtured and brought forth in folly. Its footsteps are marked with blood, slaughter, persecution, and destruction. In truth, everything that goes to constitute moral depravity and human turpitude are to be found in it. It is pregnant with misery of every kind. The mischiefs, however, recoil on the unhappy people of this country, who are made the instruments by which the wicked purposes of its authors are effected. The expense of it all has been enormous, far beyond any former experience. And for what? The loss of dear and valuable relations, slain in an impious cause. By 1780, there is rising concern everywhere in England over the increasing power of the Crown. Enter Charles James Fox. And a vote in Commons on the resolution that the influence of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. and Fox moves a vote of no confidence in North's government. At this point, with North's government about to fall, the king writes out in his own clear hand an act of abdication as follows. His Majesty, therefore, with much sorrow, finds he can be of no further use to his native country, which drives him to the painful step of quitting it forever, in consequence of which his Majesty resigns the crown of Great Britain and the dominions appertaining thereto to his lawful successor, George, Prince of Wales. He hopes he may be more successful. He who had told North never to quit is now quitting. It is North who persuades the king not to quit. North wrote to the king, "Your Majesty is well apprised that in this country," as if he's a foreigner, "in this country the prince on the throne cannot, with prudence, oppose the deliberate resolution of the House of Commons. Your royal predecessors, particularly King William III and his late Majesty George II, were obliged to yield to Commons, much against their wish, in more instances than one. Your Majesty, having persevered as long as possible on what you thought right, can lose no honour if now you yield to the opinion and wishes of the House of Commons." The reaction was the king stuffed his letter of resignation back into his desk. And at that point, North refused to serve 1 minute longer. North then has effectively resigned. Britain had decided not to bleed itself white. If it had done so, it would have been the end of England. It could not have defended itself against Napoleon if it had gone on this war, this unwinnable war in America. The final act comes in 1783, here in Paris, the Hotel York on Rue Jacob. It was the residence of David Hartley. It's now a hotel, but you can visit it and see the plaque on the wall. This is the birthplace of the United States. David Hartley was a personal friend of Franklin's, and they are kept in touch, writing to one another all this time. David Hartley then represents the United Kingdom, and he is sincerely happy to sign. The three representing the United States, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, all four then together signed the treaty. As for King George, the porphyria had left him, just left him. This was his welcome to John Adams, the first American ambassador to the Court of St. James, which is the official title of ambassadors to London. And it is remarkably warm. This is the king to Ambassador Adams. I must say that I not only receive with pleasure the assurances of the friendly disposition of the United States, but I'm very glad the choice has fallen on you to be their minister. I wish you to believe, sir, and that it may be understood in America, that I have done nothing in the late contest but what I thought myself indispensably bound to do by the duty which I owe to my people. I will be very frank with you, sir. I was the last to consent to separation, but the separation having been made and having become inevitable, I have always said, as I say now, that I will be the first to meet the friendship of the United States as an independent power. On one matter he never budged. True to the last, he wrote, "I should be miserable indeed if I felt that any blame could be laid at my door." So there you have George III in all his contradictions, and in the end you almost have to pity him. In 1788, the porphyria returned. He spoke non-stop gibberish. He turned on his son, the Prince of Wales, admittedly a rake, but nevertheless Prince of Wales. He tried to smash his son's head against the wall. His mouth was foaming. He was then virtually tortured by the medical treatment he received. They put him in a straitjacket, tied his legs to a bed. That was the king. And then, in 1789, it receded. He was sound again. The madness had gone. And then the madness returns again in 1801, and that time the country can't stand it anymore, and the rest is the poor king, as I say, a poor king who never had a vision and never understood anything, but thought he was doing his duty. He lives another 10 years in agony. Well, there's a story that may seem in some respects different from the one that you've understood, but the voice of opposition, primarily of William Pitt, later Earl of Chatham, is indeed the decisive voice that is going to change the public opinion in England to the point of a total understanding that America was right. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Oh, I'm glad. I got it.